Hi, and welcome to the Festival of Place, the Pineapples, in association with the Design Council for our keynote lunchtime talk. I'm Christine Murray, Director of the Festival of Place and Editor-in-Chief of The Developer. It's my great pleasure to welcome you. If this is your first time on AirMeet, I'm just going to let you know that you can use the chat to introduce yourself, say hello, swap links. Of course, yes, there's the emojis down below me if you want to say hello and encourage our speaker. And after the talk, you'll be invited to ask questions. So just above the chat, there is a Q&A tab. If you click on that, you can put your questions in there and I will put them to our speaker. Our speaker will speak for around 25 minutes, at which time it's your turn to support me in asking really great questions that are relevant for you and your work. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Mahak Agrawal, who is an urban planner who drives sustainable solutions for positive impact. And she has worked for the with the Center on Global Energy Policy in New York, with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Town and Country Planning Organization with the Government of India, the Institute of Transport Economics in Oslo, just to name a few. And in 2019, she founded Spatial Perspectives. And for her work on water and sanitation in India, Mahak was nominated for the 2021 Goalkeepers Global Goals Award. So welcome, Mahak. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Christine, for those kind words of introduction, and a great pleasure to be speaking today to this amazing audience. Without further ado, I can start the screen share. Please let me know if you can see that. Okay, so the slide should be visible right now.
Perfect, ready to go. I'll see you for your Q&A.
Awesome, sounds great. Thank you very much, Christine. Okay, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to everyone joining us from different parts of the world today. And again, special thanks to Christine and everyone who has been a part of the journey leading to this festival. As an urban planner, as a public policy professional, and as a sustainable artist, I, Mahak Agrawal, will be sharing reflections on urban living, especially in today's uncertain world, and in particular, what are some of the key challenges that lie ahead of us as we try to recover from the pandemic. But before I go into the weeds of the key challenges, let us look at some of the key points of deliberation in urban living discourse that have transformed with the global pandemic. While prior to pandemic, the discourse laid emphasis on responding to multifaceted inequality and inequities. And the pandemic highlighted the implications of these multifaceted inequities and inequalities. In the pre-pandemic world, we spoke about a sustainable common future and climate actions. And COVID highlighted the interconnectedness of animal health, human health, and environmental health. In fact, the pandemic accelerated and amplified the global call for action. But among the wide range of challenges that existed before us as human beings and as practitioners in the built environment, one of the biggest challenges has been to plan, develop, and manage healthy spaces, healthy places, and communities in this increasingly interconnected world. When we talk about healthy spaces or communities, one of the key challenges has been planning and managing a sanitary state of affairs. For example, every day, over 96,000 of people around the world gain access to improved sanitation facilities. By improved sanitation, I mean facilities that have adequate amount of water and are structurally stable. There are evidences from all around the world of sanitation deprivation, of a state of affairs in which people do not have access to the basic right of sanitation. And these evidences are emerging from Alaska, from Russia, from China, and we will see that these evidences are emerging from almost every other part of the world. And yes, these evidences are emerging from India as well, which are often the more cited examples of sanitation deprivation. But the strange part is that when we translate this number of 96,000 over 60,000 population, we see that these numbers and narratives of deprivation, that is sanitation deprivation, we see that there is a global call for sanitary change, a call that is not confined to low or middle income countries, as has been the common perception. In fact, many of these so-called low and middle income countries are driving a sanitary change at an accelerated pace, as we can see in the graph on the left-hand side. However, these global sanitation data sets, they often hide more than they tell. For instance, this data, which is often collected by World Bank or national organizations or census, these data sets fail to indicate that the population group which gained access to any form of sanitation but is still continuing to defecate in the open or relieve their nature's call in the open. These data sets, they even hide the fact that the population may have gained access to sanitation, but its functional use is limited, making people use the facilities sometimes throughout the day, but then relieve themselves out in the open during the night. Also, it does not indicate that the access may be limited to only a few. Often, the access is dedicated to males and other sections of the society, leaving out females, children, and most often the differently abled. But the critical issue is the fact that these numbers are critical. They guide planning, they guide public policy, they guide management, funding, and whatnot. And they guide all these critical components of urban systems at all levels of space, time, and governance. When it comes to urban India, this data hides narratives of deprivation, a deprivation of human rights that affects women in particular. Poor women are often the worst affected, usually due to defunct facilities, that is, facilities that are not at all usable or operational. Sometimes the facilities are ill-maintained that ultimately make them unusable and still get counted in the census or other data counts. And sometimes we'll see that the facilities, not just in India, but in several other parts of the world, these facilities, usually the community facilities, they are located at distances that are far away from home or work, which make it unsafe for women and girls in particularly to use them past sunset or before sunrise. Even during the day, we'll find that women and girls in Asia and different parts of the world, they travel in groups to reduce the risks of harassment and assault in the vicinity of these community facilities. These incidences are emerging more rapidly and more pronounced in these rehabilitation camps that are emerging for the displaced population in European Union as well. In some cases, we find that women are found adapting and installing makeshift arrangements in these inadequate and ill-maintained spaces for just a little bit of dignity. So we cannot be really saying that it's the people who are guided by their culture or their behavior that they want to relieve in these unsanitary conditions. It's often the fault of how we plan or manage or build around these city spaces that go around as undeveloped or less or more neglected spaces in the city fabric. One of the toughest, or I would say one of the most heartbreaking situation that I have come across is that of girls that are adapting to look like boys simply to stay safe while addressing their nature's call. And in this image, it's a 6-year-old girl who had transformed herself into a physical appearance of a boy. So when we talk about sanitary state of affairs, whether it be deprivation or inadequacies of sanitation systems in any part of the world, we need to first and foremost identify those potholes of the sanitation system, which often are related to the misplaced focus, heavy reliance on these centralized systems, focusing mindlessly on simply the provision without caring about the functional use of facilities, a lot is dependent upon the accuracy of the data as well and the limited scope of planning. Having identified these potholes of the system, we need to rework our current systems and work with the bits that work and rework the bits or missing links that will need work. In doing this, we can update the method of assessment and monitoring to include dimensions of functionality, accessibility, sustainability, affordability, efficiency, and safety. We also need to acknowledge that one solution does not fit all. Rather, using narratives to build facilities that people will use will go a long way in not just reducing the issues of sanitation deprivation, but also reducing the economic impact on the state exchequer. Next, we need to fix and fill the data gap. Also, a tested solution has been to mandate audit checks to check services for their usability. With the support of the Change.org Foundation, I started a petition in 2019, which was directed to the Health and Urban Development Ministers of Government of Delhi. In 2020, the Chief Minister of Delhi acknowledged our call for action and initiated audit checks. So I would say that irrespective of which capacity or which area you're coming from, you can always lead a change. You can always implement a positive action, no matter what the scale of impact is. Next, I would say that apart from the sanitary state of affairs, the pandemic has also highlighted the role of public spaces in the city fabric. It has made us reimagine the role of public spaces. But much like everything else, there are various perspectives and definitions of public spaces. For instance, a 2017 definition by UNESCO defines public spaces as open spaces that are accessible to all. Interestingly, this 2017 definition was ahead of its time in considering virtual spaces as a new form of public space, which we are using as well today, but a space that a lot of us in the past 2 years have been hoping to step away from to enter into the real physical public space. When it comes to India, public spaces are diverse like the country itself. This diversity exists in terms of the type of public spaces, the scale of space and activity, or the relationship that these spaces have with the stakeholders. One of the most common interaction that people associate with public spaces in India is that of leisure and cultural recreation at places of worship, at places of heritage, or at places of commerce. Another interaction that when it comes to India and public spaces is that of livelihood opportunities. These interactions and the extent of formal and informal opportunities vary in terms of scale, in terms of space, and in terms of the time. But there is also a very often ignored interaction, which is the capacity of public spaces to provide refuge to the deprived. And in several countries, we see that if it's not the urban poor, then we would be having homeless who would be using these public spaces for refuge and shelter. But in most cases, it is often tough to separate one interaction from another in public space. For each and every public space serves multiple functions. It contains informal market spaces, formal places, as well as spaces for spontaneous social gatherings and interactions. And in general, it acts as a matrix where everyday life can occur. For a long time, these varied, diverse public spaces in India were situated in two key sections of the urban agenda. One was culture, and second was public health and regulation. While some of the public spaces with deep-rooted cultural or historic significance have dedicated resource allocation, either through archaeological funds or public management funds, the majority of public spaces in India fall under the purview of public health and regulation. where the focus is limited to civic infrastructure, civic maintenance, and regulation of the informal actors and informal sector in these public spaces. In 2015, the public spaces became a part of the urban agenda on a central government level, where the focus of public spaces shifted to smart cities development. In the smart cities mission, the public spaces became one of the essential components of area-based development, wherein funds were dedicated towards the improvement of quality of life for everyone in the city, including the urban poor. With this mission, that is the Smart City mission, the role of public spaces expanded in India, but the portion of actual resources that were allocated or implemented or realized into a positive change, that remained low and it varied significantly across different sized cities. Well, 5 years down the line, when urban professionals or professionals, different professionals in the built environment, as well as administrators, were still trying to explore opportunities to rethink and reimagine India's diverse public spaces, the pandemic struck. In a 1.3 billion plus country, where life is lived in its noisy, vibrant, lively, congested, definitely, yet somehow ordered public spaces, everything changed in 2020 and now in 2021. Public spaces became feared spaces. They became spaces that people were moving away from. These were some of the busiest places that became deserted spaces, while some other spaces became places of surveillance and monitoring of the pandemic. A few months down into the nationwide lockdown, people began to move back to public spaces, and ideas to practice physical or social distancing were chalked out in several public spaces. But these circles of distancing, well, we all know I'd say 2 years down the line, we all know that these circles of distancing have not been sustainable. And we cannot even expect them to be sustainable in the long run. And in this whole public space, public health, and the pandemic discourse, one thing that has often been ignored is the fact that social distancing is a privilege for several million and several billion people all around the world. And these people, the population for whom the social distancing is a privilege, it's often the urban poor. So it makes us rethink what can we do for the millions that are living in congested settlements for whom this social or physical distancing is a privilege. Well, with cities around the world re-entering into full or partial lockdowns, with the Delta variant, the need to develop new ways to use and manage these spaces has become more urgent than ever before. The pandemic, in fact, has increased the appetite for safer and accessible public spaces. Recognizing the diversity of public spaces in India and elsewhere, as well as the varied interactions that people and practitioners associate with these places, some of the key steps in moving forward could include leveraging the economic potential of public spaces for social as well as economic recovery of cities, citizens, and in general, building back better. The second option could be building a network or alliance of community stewards to promote bottom-up planning for the public spaces. We need to also tap the opportunity that are created, well, unfortunately by the pandemic, but the opportunity for public spaces and cities to reset around equity issues. If we work smartly in the present, this disruption could really help drive new investments and solutions across different cities and at varied levels of spatial interactions. We need to also think about and along the lines of mobilizing stimulus packages for public spaces comprising social and spatial solutions, as well as policy interventions. And in this whole stimulus package, compliance by the public that needs to work in coordination would be essential to better tackle the health crisis. Not just the pandemic in the present, but any health crisis that comes in the future. Uh, moving closer to the conclusion or the end of the presentation, I would say that apart from the sanitation and public spaces, there would be general strategies for building back better, sustainable, and resilient common future. One of the efforts that we need to guide our focus towards is leveraging national urban policies to build back better. The national urban policies are, in general, common vision and coordinated diverse. It's a common vision that is coordinated by different actors to achieve the vision of resilient, sustainable, and climate resilient future. So these national urban policies, they can act as an instrument to shape more resilient, green and inclusive cities as part of the country's recovery packages during and post-pandemic. These policies can help engage local and regional authorities as well as different stakeholder groups in the design as well as the implementation and monitoring of the national urban policies. And also, it would be really important to consider varied sources of finance to really support the implementation of these policies at national, state, as well as local levels. Lastly, I would say that we need to really invest in robust urban scale data to design policies and implement solutions that facilitate accountability and integrity. To sum it up, I would say that the pandemic has highlighted more than ever before how integrally linked cities are to public health and urban living. It has also amplified the demand for more public outdoor spaces that are accessible and safe for use. On a parting note, I'd say that whatever the next version of normal, if there would ever be, well, whatever the next version of that normal looks like, and whatever environmental, public health, or social challenges we might face, we need systemic and systematic changes. And some of these changes are needed for our common future as well as for the present. These changes might be temporary, but many changes will continue. And one of those changes has to be an amplified demand for healthy communities and the environment, a demand that has to expand beyond one discipline, and it has to be expanded to all communities around the world. And on that note, I'd end the presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any question that come up in the chat.
Thank you so much, Mahak. I want to invite those in the audience, if you would like to put your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A tab, which is above the chat, and I'll take them. Yes, please, lots of emoji applause for our guest speaker today. So I wanted to drill into that. Last slide has so much on it around accelerating the urban climate adaptation plans and strategies. So just to link into it, a little bit. You talk about the need for filling some of those data gaps. What are some of the data gaps that you think we are looking at, and where do you see pressing need for better data?
So when it comes to the data needs, we need to really understand that data needs to be collected at different levels of planning and implementation. So we cannot say that the local level data is enough to be really affecting change. We need differential scales of data at national, at state, as well as the local level. So for example, if we talk about climate adaptation and climate mitigation, at local level, we need to identify those hotspots of different risks that are existing across the geography. And these risks need to be categorized into avoidable risks and unavoidable risks. So basically, we have to be really cognizant of the multifaceted implications of any challenge, not just climate change, but any challenge that is affecting the population at local level or any level of planning and governance. What all data points do we need at what would be the periodicity of collection of those data points, and who would be the stakeholders who would be, say, collecting that data, managing that data, and really using that data. So it's a whole gamut of issues and opportunities that exist only in that data management side. So once that is clear, we can really be able to affect change at any level of planning and governance. And thank you very much for that question, Christine.
Well, it's interesting. You talk about this, sorting it into avoidable risk and unavoidable risks.
Mhm.
Can you give some examples of what that might look like? So, what would you classify as an avoidable and unavoidable?
Definitely. So if I take an example, I'll take an example from India. So in India, on the eastern coast, on the southeastern coast of India, there's a state called as Odisha. So that state is highly prone to cyclones every year, and every year the state is affected by cyclones. That is an unavoidable risk. You cannot control the cyclone. What you can do is adapt to the cyclone and mitigate the losses that will emerge from that cyclone. In 1996, that state was affected tremendously. It lost its electricity and connection to the rest of the country for 10 days straight. But then the state really learned from that incident that they need to build back better. That was a time when that term was not even really popularized by any conventions. So what they did was they realized that yes, these are the population and these are the geographies within the state that are highly vulnerable to the effects of cyclone. They categorize that the effect would be to the different sectors. For instance, agriculture would be most affected. Transportation and energy were the next in line in terms of priority areas that were priority sectors that were getting affected. They started to plot out what are the different populations that will be affected and started developing strategies that, if a cyclone warning has been issued by the meteorological department, then this is the first area that needs to be evacuated. And people were like, capacity development not just happened at administration level, it happened with the people on ground. So now whenever a warning is issued, people know where they have to seek refuge. Schools have been converted into cyclone protection shelters, which are now, people are not really, migrating hundreds and thousands of kilometers just to seek refuge. They know that 5-10 kilometers down the road, they have a shelter where they can seek refuge. They would be provided with food, with water, with basic necessities that they need to survive that cyclone. So, yes, it's an unavoidable risk, but there are several costs and factors that can be avoided from that unavoidable risks. It all depends upon what are we really doing with the knowledge we have, how are we building back better and more resilient in the future with that.
We saw through COVID a very uneven pandemic, which I think speaks to some of the points you've made about inequality in our cities, in areas that were more dense or more impoverished, or where more people were working in jobs where they could not take any form of social distancing. So I guess my question is, you've pointed to a data gap there, where you talked about the provision of sanitation and then the actual people who can't use it for various reasons. How do we go about, I suppose, data collection in those areas? I mean, and where are we going wrong in terms of local data being actually collected? What groups are missing from those data? And has the digitalization of data helped or hindered the way that we collect on the ground, super local information about things like overcrowding or deprivation or?
Yes. So in that regard, I think there are two key challenges with that. One is definitely the density and the overcrowding. That when we talk about like the government accepted norm or government accepted data, it's usually the census data, be it India or any part of the world. Census is given the highest priority. But it's again, when it comes to overcrowded parts of the cities, it's tough to include each and every household, because sometimes households emerge while the census is being conducted. So you never are able to cover 100% of the population. But then there are opportunities for conducting data collection through digital modes of communication. For instance, in several parts of the world, people are trying and have been trying, especially during the pandemic, to use simple phones, not smartphones, but simple phones, to give a missed call on a number which is free. What do we call it? A free number, which helps identify that if you are facing, say, X issue, you just have to dial this number. And it helps you flag off that these are the areas in which we are getting, say, X number of calls. That means these are the hotspots. So in a way, we are able to fill that data gap. And again, it comes down to how we identify what is the best tool in terms of cost, in terms of the efficiency, and in terms of the scope, which would help us respond to that challenge. So that is really, really important. And if I say in terms of, say, India, which again has a very uh, tough challenge of responding to the sanitation, especially in the urban slums, which are the like the areas where urban poor are concentrated. One of the biggest challenge is, yes, data collection, but the other challenge is the legality that is associated with these population groups. So in general, one would associate these spaces as spaces where people have started to squat illegally, because these are public spaces or private spaces which people do not have the right to live over. So the government would simply provide the basic minimum facilities and not care about what comes after that. And that is, again, a big issue. So if we have the data that these are the hotspots, but then we are not collecting data on the performance or not doing anything with that performance data, then again, how we use that data becomes redundant.
I wanted to ask you, you contributed to this report that looked at national urban policies for climate resilience. What did you find was associated with, or what do you think is associated with success in terms of the kind of national urban policies that would result in more climate resilient adaptation?
Yes, so in that policy, in that program, which is the Global State of National Urban Policy Program, it was a collaboration with UN Habitat, Cities Alliance, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We found out through analysis of 162 nations that several nations, majority of the nations, in fact, are working towards these national urban policies, which is basically a shared vision towards climate action, resilient future, and inclusive cities by involving different stakeholders. And in cases where we found that success is really getting implemented at national and at local level, we found that one common element was the fact that that shared vision is truly built on common vision involving different stakeholders at national, at state or sub-regional level, as well as the local level. So the key players are part of that vision, vision shaping mission. And when it comes to really implementing it, again, those stakeholders are part of that implementation cycle. And another factor that really stood out for those successful nations was the fact that they were not relying only on the government finance to really implement any action. So alternative sources of finances were being explored and were being deployed at local level and especially at the state level, which again stood out for the fact that, climate action, we always say that it's a call for global action. Everyone has to act on it, but then everyone has to act on it at different dimensions, on different dimensions, whether it's vision, whether it's implementation, whether it's finance, or even just raising the demand for action.
And do you see where we go wrong? Where does policy, fail to result in action? Like you said, you require this alignment at the local and regional and national level. But I think we've all been in, certainly from our perspective, we see a lot of organizations and groups and stakeholders declaring a climate emergency, but then we see very little tangible result of that declaration. So when does it not happen?
Well, that is a lot happens, like I would say that disjoint happens on the stage when we're talking about the performance monitoring. So if we have developed that shared vision, we have started implementing actions, and we have like mobilized that resource, but we are not monitoring what that impact has been, what is the timeline of implementation of those projects, how are we learning from those implementation. And again, like if I say that we base our vision from something that's that happened 10 years back and what will happen 10 years down the future, but then that future changes, say 3 years down the line, if we are not learning from that change, from that dynamism, from what we are implementing on the ground, then that action will not yield the X amount of result that we were expecting. So in a way, we found out that yes, we need to do a lot of things, but most important of that would have to be monitoring the performance and learning from it and realigning or repurposing what we planned out to do.
And for that monitoring, what are some of the metrics that people are looking at? Is it kind of, if it's around flood resiliency, is it like how many homes are now being made more resilient, or what is it? Is it kind of ticking off percentages of adaptation, or does it even matter? It's just about actually looking at what you're doing and whether you're going in the right.
Well, within the scope of the program, the Global State of National Urban Policy Program, we did not break down the parameters because we were interacting with each nation. And each nation has different performance indicators and different ways of measuring that performance. But in general, when we talk about the performance of policies and actions, it usually focuses on how many say how many loss of hectares of productive land have we abated, how much loss of life have we prevented, or how much loss of property have we prevented. That would be in terms of mitigation. But then when we talk about how the climate itself is changing, that would again say that, say in 2020, we predicted the temperature would change by 1 degree Celsius. But in 2023, when we are doing the performance monitoring, we find that, say, it increased by 1.05%. We need to again develop or again run the data through the simulations and through the data modeling to see now how do we realign the actions that we had planned in the medium or the long term. So it's a like back and forth cycle of taking stock and realigning actions.
So that constant process of checking how this dynamic model is changing and also checking your progress against it and then realigning it based on how the parameters are changing.
Yes,
it's been very difficult to watch through the pandemic, the lack of coordination on a global scale, the kind of and I know that this was looking at the national urban policies within each country, but also how do we learn to work with each other across nations, and where are the gaps there?
That's a very tough question. So I would say that it's not that nations do not have policies or frameworks for that cross-national communication and interaction. All the diplomatic ties that each nation has built with other nations, that has been built over decades and in fact for some centuries. So for instance, when we look into the example of the pandemic itself, there were several finger pointings towards one nation not sharing the relevant information as to when the outbreak happened initially or what would be the impact of that outbreak. Well, it was not that, the World Health Organization or the other independent nations did not have a protocol. They did have a protocol, but if one nation decides to not communicate it, it has to be held accountable. But unfortunately, there is no I would say there is no legal mechanism to hold somebody accountable. It's all driven by incentives, voluntary, or several nations coming together, backing up different nations, saying that yes, we need answers. But if the geopolitics decides that no, we are happy with how things are doing, we don't want to probe it further, then of course we cannot be doing anything about it.
So, is there, with accountability on climate adaptation is a huge issue.
Yes.
Are we seeing any movement? We have an international criminal court with this idea that there are, crimes against humanity that need to be taken outside of national criminal justice systems to make the world a better place, effectively, and to is there any sense that climate justice or some kind of global climate justice will become a possibility, and what would that allow us to do?
I think again there is a varied response to that because again there is no legal stature that says that acting on climate is or simply saying that climate justice is a human right. There is no legal stature to that. We hope that the environmental laws will evolve accordingly, and we are seeing evidences from Netherlands and from different parts of the world in which climate justice is being declared as a human right. But until and unless we see that, a majority of the nations are actually doing it, we cannot really be saying that climate has become a fundamental part of the environmental law or international law in general. And there's a lot of discussion going about it, because a lot of people are trying to bring, if say that climate cannot be a part of the environmental law, then we have to use the law that exists and guide it towards the major emitters. So a lot of the people and a lot of organizations are bringing fossil fuel companies to the court and saying that you need to control your emissions. And again, different countries around the world are mandating companies like Shell, which I guess it's one of the biggest fossil fuel, I would say, carbon emitters. They have been brought to the court and they have been mandated to reduce their emissions by 50% by 2030 or 2050. So that's a big, bold move. And to really see a change from that big, bold move, we need accountability. Okay, so in the present, some judge has said that Shell would be held accountable, but 10 years down the line, who is holding them accountable? That framework needs to be set in place as well. So I would say a complex system of policies, stakeholders, and really holding people accountable.
So many of the people watching and are working within urban design and urban development and architecture, and they're looking to see policies come in to help support them to push through work. When you want to do good work, but actually the policies themselves are not demanding that investment or that extra time to actually focus on more resilient fabric, more resilient approaches to work. So I guess we should be holding our policymakers accountable for delivering. What kind of policy should we be demanding of them, of our politicians, and what and how shall we hold them accountable for that? How should we measure, when their term comes up, whether they've really put in place lasting policy?
Yes, again, thank you for another great question. So one of the, I would say, the current movement in holding people accountable, especially the public policy and judges as well as legal practitioners, has been first and foremost that nations at the national level need to acknowledge that we are living in a state of climate emergency. We need to be implementing urgent action. So the first starting point has been to declare the climate emergency at national level, because that would drive actions at every other level within a nation. Following that, holding public policy makers accountable, that would have to be a bi-directional accountability road. So when it comes to public policy makers, the lawmakers would also have to keep on pushing the policy makers to actually develop policies to be recognizing the various impacts of climate change and the various actions that need to be implemented to either adapt or mitigate against that climate change. The other way would be for the people themselves to hold these policymakers accountable by making it a part of, again, it varies nation to nation, but several nations are trying to include how each policymaker or politician, who are usually the people's representative, how in their own tenure have they invested in climate actions, how have they been able to mitigate or adapt or reduce the loss of life, property, and other areas through their investments. And that becomes a part of the accountability framework that is there, that is in place in a nation. For instance, if we talk about US or India, then they have general offices for accounting general. And the accounting general works at the national level, but they also work at the sub-regional as well as local level. So it's a huge task for the accounting general, but it is a necessary task that needs to be there and needs to be formalized to hold people accountable for whatever funding that is going through or whatever actions are being planned for climate resilient future.
I love the simplicity of that accountability in the sense that, how are you preventing lives being lost? Are you preventing loss of property and usable land? And I think you had a third. What was the third one?
It would be different I would say, loss of income and livelihoods from different sectors.
Yeah, and I think that's that amazing simplicity to hold politicians and policymakers to account about how much they are preventing. And I probably would just add to that, pollution is one of those things that makes these places unlivable or uninhabitable. So they may be an invisible source of making it unusable, but it falls into that lack of livelihood and that lack of land.
Yes.
Well, that just leaves me to thank you so much for being here today and joining us at the Festival of Place. It's been really interesting to hear about your work and to actually delve into some of those policies. We do have a climate emergency to tackle. So I'm going to really want to thank you for allowing me to ask you lots of questions as well.